Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with the Mishna Yomi Masechet Shabbat. We are up to Perek Yud Bet, Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnah should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. We learned earlier in Mishnah 4 that one is liable for the melacha of writing if he wrote two letters in a single lapse of awareness. Now this Mishnah says a machloke about a person who wrote each letter during a separate lapse of awareness. Now we know if someone bishogeg inadvertently performs the melacha several times in a single lapse of awareness, he is obligated to bring only one hatat offering, like we learned earlier in chapter 7 Mishnah 1. However, if he repeats the melacha during a second lapse of awareness, he now incurs a second obligation. So the Mishnah begins, Hakotev shte otiyot b'shte alamot. If one writes two letters in two lapses of awareness, so for example, he wrote one letter without realizing that the day is Shabbat, then he remembered that it is Shabbat, but then he forgot again and wrote a second letter next to the first, Achat shacharit v'achat ben arbaim, or if he writes one letter in the morning and one in the afternoon, meaning there was enough time between writing each letter to remember that it is Shabbat, and that in such a case is that although he did not actually remember, he is treated as though he remembered since there was enough time for him to do so. So there's a machloket brought down in the Mishnah. Rabban Gamliel mechayev. Rabban Gamliel rules that he is liable. According to Rabban Gamliel, the Mefarshim explain, a lapse of awareness does not end until the person becomes aware or had time to become aware that he performed an entire melacha. Therefore, if he remembered after writing just one letter, which is only part of the melacha, the first lapse of awareness did not end, but it remained in effect, and he therefore wrote both letters during a single lapse of awareness, which renders him liable. And Rabban Gamliel learns this rule from a pasuk in the Torah. The Chachamim Potrin, however, the sages rule that he is exempt. The sages hold that in order for a lapse of awareness to end, the person doesn't have to become aware that he did an entire melacha. Rather, it's enough for him to become aware, have time to become aware that he did part of a melacha. Therefore, in the above case where he became aware after writing only one letter, the first lapse of awareness ended and a new one began before he wrote the second letter, and therefore he did the melacha over two lapses of awareness for which there is no liability. And the Rav says, V'lecha kechachamim, the Lecha follows the opinion of the sages. And that is in Rabotai of chapter 12, Mishnah Vav. We continue now with chapter 13, Mishnah Alayev. This Mishnah says a machloket about the minimum amount a person must weave to be liable for the melacha of weaving. We learned earlier in chapter 7, Mishnah 2, weaving is accomplished by raising one harness of a loom and lowering the other, thereby creating a gap between the even-numbered and odd-numbered warp threads, and then passing the weft thread from one side of the warp threads to the other. Rabotai, not so much for today's Mishnah, or maybe even for today's and on, I suggest using the article elucidated to see the diagrams so we can understand, because we're not so used to these melachot of weaving, what's warp, what's weft, or if you have any other illustrated Mishnayot. Let us begin. Rabbi Eliezer says, Ha'oreg shlosha chutin batechila, if one weaves the first three threads at the start of weaving a new piece of cloth, ve'echad al ha'arig, or adds even a single thread to a cloth that is already partially woven. So again, just to read it again. Ha'oreg shlosha chutin batchila, if one weaves the first three threads at the start of weaving a new piece of cloth. Now, when the Mishnah mentions thread, it does not mention individual threads. Rather, it refers to the long weft thread, which is passed from one side of the loom to the other. Each pass is called a thread, since it creates a new line in the cloth being woven. Or ve'echad al harig, he adds even a single thread to a cloth that is already partially woven. Hayav, he is liable. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, a person is liable for weaving only if his work will stay in place and not unravel. So therefore, for him, a minimum of 3 threads is required. However, Rabbi Eliezer holds that if the weaving process had already begun, adding just one thread already suffices for liability because it combines with the previous 2 to form a set of 3. And Rabbi Eliezer holds that a person is liable even for just finishing a melacha. V'chachamim omrim, but the sages say, ben batchila, ben basof, shiur shnei chutin. Whether one is at the start of weaving a cloth or at the end of weaving a cloth, meaning he's working on a cloth that is already partially woven, the minimum amount is 2 threads. Now, according to the sages, 2 threads is the minimum measurement for the melacha of weaving, like we said earlier in chapter 7, Mishnah 2. And the Mefarshim explain, even if the fabric is already partially woven, the weaver must must add 2 threads. It would not be enough to add 1 thread to another that's already in place, because the Chachamim maintain that merely finishing a melacha is not enough to affect liability. Rather, one must do the entire melacha, as we learned in chapter 12, Mishnah 5. And the Rav says, Ve'en halacha k'Rabbi Eliezer, the halacha does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, the halacha follows the opinion of the sages. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.